Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil karim. Thank you. Terima kasih Saudara Fauzan, Profesor Osman, PPFPM, PPAS dan juga IIIT. Ini saya jelaskan peringkat awal, saya ini bukan ahli falsafah. Cuma sahabat Saudara Osman yang memberikan sutikan pandangan tentang falsafah sejak dia di Philadelphia memberi kuliah kepada saya tentang Al-Biruni pada ketika itu. Tetapi saya melihat falsafah ini untuk memudahkan sebagai kerangka besar. Kita bicara soal ekonomi, soal politik, soal masyarakat, soal sejarah, soal kehidupan tanpa suatu pegangan besar. Jadi kerangka besar ini penting. Umpamanya kita tentukan orang itu baik atau tidak kerana derma kepada kita, tanpa merujuk kepada etika dan moral dari sumber derma. Ada orang dikatakan sangat mulia kerana dia umrah setiap tahun, tetapi jirannya terlantar, kelaparan atau tahap pendidikan yang sangat lemah, ataupun sumbernya itu dari kehilangan bala yang dicurinya atau dirompaknya. Jadi sebab itu kerangka falsafah ini yang bersandarkan etika yang dibicarakan sejak zaman lampau sehinggalah kebangkitan Islam. Malah di barat sendiri pun bila kita bicara umpamanya jatuh bangun Empire Rome, itu juga terkait dengan kekuatan atau kehilangan atau terhakisnya akhlak, walaupun mungkin penafsirannya itu juga berbeza dari persepsi Islam. Tetapi yang nyata ialah kehilangan nilai dan moral. Sebab itu umpamanya bila ada perkembangan, ini pernah dikupas secara lebih mendalam oleh Hussein Nasr, bila ada perkembangan umpamanya penolakan falsafah secara menyeluruh di kalangan masyarakat Islam, terutama di kalangan sunnah wal jamaah, kerana pengaruh yang kental dari Hujatul Islam Al-Ghazali bila menolak yang kita sebut tahafut al-falasifah. Walaupun ada dialognya tapi tenggelam. Ibn Rushd dengan tahafut itu tenggelam. Itu yang dibahaskan seperti mana lebih mudah kita baca Al-Mukiz bin Adhalal, Deliverance of Error, itu lebih mudah untuk memahami bahawa yang ditekankan ialah sebenarnya kehilangan nilai kerohanian dan etika. Jadi kebimbangan Al-Ghazali itu berasas, tapi bukan bermakna kita menolak kerangka besar falsafah dalam hidup. Jadi sebab itu saya lalukan kerana tentunya persatuan falsafah ini boleh menghidupkan balik, ya, kerana ada ketandusan. Ada orang mengatakan ini too philosophical, not realistic, not relevant. Jadi ini menyebabkan ada keengganan kita bicara dan mengkaji falsafah kerana dia bukan lagi utilitarian dari segi bidang pekerjaan. Jadi mahasiswa tidak digalakkan. Padahal pada hemat saya, kerangka besar, walaupun kita tak guna istilah falsafah, kerangka besar pemikiran itu harus ada yang terkait dengan soal agama, soal akhlak, soal nilai. Jadi oleh yang demikian saya anggap kalau kita lihat umpamanya sekarang dalam perbicaraan tadi disentuh tentang COVID-19, permasalahan ekonomi, ya, yang dibahaskan, ya, kegagalan sistem kapitalis. Kalau kita baca Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam oleh Muhammad Iqbal, katanya pertembungan kapitalisme dan komunisme atau sosialisme itu adalah pertembungan di antara apa yang disebut pertembungan budaya yang sensate, budaya yang materialistik, ya. Jadi agak terkeluar daripada konsepsi falsafah kita, kerana yang kita mahu tekankan semula adalah sistem ekonomi yang berakar kepada nilai Dan nilai ini tidak boleh lari dari apa yang kita sebut tentang kebenaran, tentang keadilan dan tentang kesejahteraan. Jadi apa dia arti kemajuan atau pembangunan tanpa keadilan, tanpa kesejahteraan dan terus memikirkan masalah umat yang lebih ramai. Ini bagi saya penting untuk kita hujahkan supaya orang bicara soal ekonomi ini tidak hanya dari segi angka pertumbuhan ataupun pelaburan asing, tetapi dari sudut konsep yang boleh menjamin keadilan, kesejahteraan, kerana sumber yang diperoleh itu harus diagihkan secara adil dan bersama. Ini sekali lagi saya katakan perlu kita bawa semula sama ada konsepsi dari yang berakar kepada ahli ekonomi Islam atau juga yang barat seperti John Rawls yang banyak bicara tentang distributive justice, yang sebenarnya bukan ekonomi per se tetapi ekonomi yang terkait dengan etika dan moral yang menyebut tentang yang memperlihatkan kesungguhan kita berbicara kerangka besar the philosophy of economics, seperti juga philosophy of education. Kita tengok umpamanya, I think I need to move on to English, I suppose, in regard for the participants, particularly from overseas. My apologies because my intro was a bit extended in Bahasa. Now, I was stressing the importance of philosophy, which I sometimes term in a popular sense the broader outlook, because when we discuss economics or politics, education or history, is always a very practical consideration without regard to the broader view on values and ethics. We had a problem. Hussein Nasser actually deliberated at length on this. Why is it the Muslim world, contemporary Muslim world in the past generations, not evolve a better understanding or study of philosophy, particularly among the Sunnis? Attributed it to Tahafut al-Falsafah of Imam al-Ghazali, not necessarily to be too critical of his writings, but to understand and appreciate the fact that those who propagate anti-philosophy as something alien or secular or materialistic or Greek is the failure to understand the context of Al-Ghazali's criticism when he observed the excesses due to the ratio, the dependence on akal, without regard to the spiritual dimension, ethics, and values. So I think if we hold strongly to the issue of awalul awail, the core principles, values of faith, ethics, and values, then there is greater sense and relevance to our understanding of philosophy. Why do I suggest that we need to have a broad outlook? Student of history will understand history in terms of chronology, dates, events. But the Quranic interpretation of history takes a more philosophical, ethical, value-based understanding. Not particular about name of a person or date or particular event, but the moral message and the values to be imparted. And essentially that's what the Quranic interpretation of history, which we could only be well appreciated if one understand the whole philosophical concept of history, or the interpretation. As you know, in the tafsir, we have translation, we have tafsir, and we have ta'wil. Precisely because without the understanding of history, of antecedents of history, of context and also the overall maqasid of the Sharia, or the entire maqasid of the understanding, we will not be able to grasp the and ta'wil and tafsir of the Quranic essence and message. And that to me is the relevance of philosophy, which need to be imparted as a popular subject. We may call it a Madani society, you may call it a civilized society, but essentially it is a broader understanding, a broader dimension. I alluded to the issue of economics, for example, the enormous debate, and now, of course, with Piketty talking about inequality. Essentially, this is a growth, a capitalistic model that disregard the issue of ethics, values, justice. Because what's justice? Justice is, of course, as Rawls put it, as fairness. But devoid of values, you disregard the importance of distributive justice, to quote again or paraphrase John Rawls. So to my mind, again, even understanding of economics, we must see the greater dimension. Piketty talks about inequality. We have been talking about it for generations. But when it comes to application or implementation of economic programs, is still purely capitalistic, materialistic approach without regard to the issue of ethics or morality. And some of our sheikhs will talk about morality in terms of, okay, no gambling, no riba, without this focus on the fact that distributive justice is a core principle in Islamic economics, which viewed from a broader philosophical framework. The other minor issues, and Osman is speaking after me, I'm not able to compete him in the subject. I can compete him on issue of governance and politics probably, but not philosophy. The issue of civilization, among Muslims, among the Chinese, among the Indians, there's of course the great troves of nostalgia, okay? The great Islamic civilization. Okay, understanding is important, but it cannot be purely nostalgic. Okay? It needs to be explored. For Malaysians, for example, because we live in the multiracial, multicultural society, a Muslim understanding of Islamic civilization is fundamental, but our understanding of Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, is equally important, other than understanding Western civilization. But not purely for the purpose of nostalgia, but it's important to appreciate that finally the civilization is an evolutionary process. There are fundamental principles, ingredients that can evolve a society. This is very much a Khaldunian theory, a principle that from the nomadic Umran to Umran Madani, where the civilization evolved, or Umran to Umran Hadari, to quote Ibn Khaldun. Yes, Abdul Rahman Ibn Khaldun. Now, if we accept that it is an evolutionary process, then the society must have understanding, must popularize this concept, and work to ensure that it actually evolve. It is, in a sense, evolving and reiterative. Some of the core principles must be reiterated. Some of the fundamentals, the core principles remain. I mean, there will of course be change which is necessary. And I think we need to then appreciate the fact that academics must initiate this in a more aggressive manner. And I of course, I'm glad to learn that the society has been active. It's not really popular compared to economic society or some political parties, but viewed in the societal context, in civilizational context, this sort of academic endeavor to initiate, to encourage a better understanding, it is really critical to my mind. Now, I get back to, for example, issue of the broader framework of understanding, which is essentially philosophy. And I want to bring back to the issue of economic because we are so engrossed with economic issues, particularly the period of the COVID-19 pandemic. But even in our schools and our universities, talking about Adam Smith, I'm always reminded them, look, Adam Smith writings is not only Wealth of Nations, of pure crude capitalism. I was reminded by Professor Thompson in one of our dialogues. Emma is, of course, the wife of Amartya Sen, who reminded me that even in Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith mentioned the word inequality 17 times. But we will not be able to understand the philosophical construct of Adam Smith without reading the theory of moral sentiments. And the theory of moral sentiments by Adam Smith is hardly read in universities. But that prepares, or at least forms the core principles of his late economic outlook. Because theory of moral sentiments talk about the issue of justice, about morality, about no oppression, which must be highlighted. Otherwise, is somewhat condoned. So that is why we bring back to the issue of philosophy with ethics and values, and more so as Muslims, if you look at the Islamic groundwork, when you talk about governance and political system, economics, or even understanding of our own history, the core principles of ethics and values cannot be discarded. So again, may I reiterate my strong admiration for those of you who probably takes a minority position in this country, in Muslim societies, insisting and talking and deliberating on issue of philosophy, humanity, in the period when people are motivated by greed, by power, as you see what's happening in this country, when you feel that you're going to lose power, when you don't have enough members of parliament to support you, then you start asking for emergency rule. Ridiculous, unfortunate, but why? Again, this is politics devoid of ethics and morality. This is politics devoid of any understanding of the philosophy of growth, philosophy development, or what governance entails. May Allah give us a strength and pray for us. We are now in Malaysia in very, very critical time, particularly in terms of the issue of governance, and inshallah truth and justice will ultimately prevail. Thank you again to colleagues who has taken this initiative, and I must say that I'm quite impressed by the numbers of the more impractical guys who realize that philosophy, humanity must be well understood in the world where materialism and the need of today becomes more prominent and demanding. Thank you again. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you Yang Berhormat Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim for the opening speech just now. So ladies and gentlemen, we will continue the ceremony with a keynote address by Professor.
what hikmah. Maybe some you have questions
Okay.
on the chat. Maybe Datuk Sri going to answer at least two questions. Number one is from Brother Shamid on chat room. How to make the concept of maqasid substantive rather than mere slogans? This question from Shamid. And Nurul Balkis, what is the real definition of reform in your understanding, and is it compatible with Islam? In what sense? Thank you. First two questions.
Well, firstly, issue of maqasid is looking at the higher objectives. We talk about hudud or sharia or economics without looking at the broader principles. To me, how do you then apply it? I mean, firstly, it has to be clear understanding. You see, the teaching of religion, teaching of economics, teaching of history need a re-evaluation, precisely because we want to ensure that the maqasid, the ultimate objectives, are well understood. Look at the way the masses understand Islam. How do you evaluate and assess Muslim role or relevance? You can see the debate sometimes. How the issue of intolerance, issue of racism, really confusing because we look at details without looking at the broader picture. And I mentioned, of course, in the Quranic interpretation, why we talk about again translation and tafsir and ta'wil, why we talk about asbabun nuzul, why we talk about text and context. But these are important. But I think some of the brothers here, professors, could deliberate further. But the issue of reform, when I initiated this in 1998, this was the Quranic text, in uridu illa al-islah mastata', that Nabi Allah Shu'aib alayhi salam, in his attempt and his prayers, that I will do and endeavor to change and undertake islah and reform to the best of my ability. Meaning always to do something better. In law, reform means a judicial independence. But reform also means laws that are just. You can have very good judges but very poor laws. You can have very good laws and rotten judges. So I think that is why I think in the reform must be overall, I mean, encompassing. Look at the issue of economics again. You talk about how do you initiate reform. We want to encourage foreign direct investments. That Malaysia, for example, in most of our countries, should be an attractive destination for foreign direct investments. But is it for growth? Is it for numbers? Or is it to ensure that the issue of justice must prevail? For example, the rules must be applied. Whether the application, the approval is through corruption or bribery, whether you do this to enrich the few at the expense of the majority. These are, to me, fundamental principles which need not necessarily be confined to the Muslim viewpoint, but if you in many of our discourses, even with the West, I mean, Osman and the rest who are familiar would understand that some people in the West have stronger views on economic justice than the so-called Muslim scholars, which is, to me, unfortunate, because our economics has been so engrossed in the issue of, I said, riba and zakat, which of course are core, but then they miss also the equally important issues of justice, of inequality, which is more confounding and critical to the Muslim world than the rest. And so you can see the gross inequality, the grinding poverty in Muslim world has been more challenging, which takes us to the point that we actually need to do more and think aloud this issue of reform more than other societies. An issue of politics and governance, is worse, of course. Politics, they say now members of parliament is decided not on his values or principles or policies, but on real monetary value. This is actually gives what I used to quote Thomas Herman Kahn a long time ago when I decided not to be active in politics. I said politics was becoming an uncharismatic, low moral profession. Now that I'm in politics, my God, I'm riddled with this issue of uncharismatic, low moral profession. How to make it more charismatic based on values, how to make sure that it is not a low moral profession, but be judged by your principles and values. Of course, it is the art of the possible in limited sense. We need to meander, you need to negotiate, but there are some core values that you cannot compromise. So what I mean by reform is a societal reform. Is the country must reform. The quality of education, the role of civil society, the role of governance, economic policies, educational policy. You must allow for this sort of reform in order to alleviate and enhance the capabilities of society. Terima kasih. Okay?
Okay, so Aristobraham from from ISTEC actually. How do we inculcate the love of philosophy in a school when we do not have enough educators on the matter? Will it take a generation for this to happen? And if so, will it to be too late? Given the fact that we live in the highly competitive world, how can we take a step back and appreciate the effort, the moment of realization of cognizance? Another question from by Haki from Brunei. How can Islamic world can be accepted wholeheartedly by every nation from the top to the bottom, no matter what race and religion? Then Professor Tajuddin Muhammad Rasdi asked question. Wonderful to hear about teaching philosophy at the young student, but I am sad that there is very little discussion in the media, especially on interpreting religious values from the philosophy construct. Religion is simply treated as doctrinal and will lose it should be if not interpreted intelligently within a global cultural and modern lifestyle construct. Religious value discussion in Malaysia from politician and cleric or ulama are at the Chinese level. This is what Professor Tajuddin said. And Dr. Abdul Hakim Muhammad, I guess what is your opinion on religious freedom in this country? Some say that we are far behind religious philosophy. I guess that's all. I think too many questions. We can discuss up to 10:45, Dr. Sri.
Okay. Sorry. I'm not the speaker. They tricked me to this, you see, because I thought I'm just giving an address and then shut up. I fully acknowledge that certain areas that I have some limited competence in some areas that I don't. So I will just respond to things I can. How do you teach philosophy and make it interesting? It depends on teachers. I think the association must deliberate further. Sometimes in our experience, subjects become interesting because the way the teacher performs. It is not an issue of dry subject, but also how I find some teachers can even make mathematics interesting. I didn't have that teacher, unfortunately, but I know my history teacher was amazing. He could entice us to take European history in a period when nobody takes European history in our generation. People only learn Asian history or Islamic history, but he could entice us to show how interesting it was. And finally we became more interested. So I think this is a subject that I think the association can deliberate how to make the subject interesting. you see among the Chinese, I see we're talking about it's here on my table essentially how they make Confucius interesting by series of philosophy made in simple amazing cartoons. Then you have this Romance of the Three Kingdoms, one of the Chinese classics, and how they make it so interesting by having these stories in comics. Nobody talks about philosophy here, but it is actually a treatise in philosophy, made easy and to others. I mean, I think sometimes probably in Islamic ethics people are, more I should say circumspect into making this, but I think it is important. Even I do it. I must admit that after reading Confucius and Romance of the Kingdom, sometimes a form of relaxation, I will look at these comics, which I think Professor Osman would be shocked, but that is the truth. Sometimes and these are real quotes, mind you. So I mean that's how philosophy can be made interesting. Partly. I'm not talking about cartoons or comics, but it's partly how you devise. Otherwise, how do you teach Al-Ghazali and make it interesting to students? That would be a major task of any guru. Now, the brother Brunei asked about understanding Islam. Is true because this whole crux of Orientalism, I may recall this, when Edward Said wrote Orientalism, one of the known Israeli scholars, Martin Kramer, if I'm not mistaken, wrote in a critique of Edward Said to suggest what? He said, this book, Orientalism, because it was a devastating critique of Orientalism or in the West, the prejudice against Islam and virtually the developing world, the view that we in the West have this monopoly of civilization, the rest are the other. So Martin Kramer said that this book was not just a tour de force, but was so effective in provoking the intellectuals to rethink about the whole idea of Orientalism and Islam and the Arab world, to the extent that Martin Kramer suggested that this book was more compelling, dangerous, effective than the Iranian Revolution. Can you imagine? One book, Orientalism, according to this Jewish scholar, was more effective than the Iranian Revolution. Now, which comes to mind, as our brother from Brunei asked, the issue is tough because the prejudice is real. I mean, I talk to friends, and the lack of understanding, the prejudice, the ignorance is shocking. Again, to quote Edward Said, when he talks about it's not a clash of civilization of Huntington, but it's a clash of ignorance. This huge ignorance of the West, again, about Islam and about the other, but it's also, to an extent, lack of understanding and quite ignorance on our part in the Muslim world about the West. It is homogeneous, it is one. So it is important, therefore, to inculcate that understanding. How do you do it? I mean, this is one of the methods. We write, we deliberate, we have seminars, we encourage all to participate, Muslims, non-Muslims, without prejudice, and this is, to me, critical. Brother Tajuddin, I think the issue of philosophy was not very clear, the question, but I think philosophy, how to encourage the further discourse and how about the religious view, I'm not sure, but you mean to say that some of the clerics may not support this notion? I think, to my mind, leave the clerics alone. I mean, some of the traditional scholars, some at times have problems not only with this the party, it's like party, in terms of how they view. They think that we are too liberal. What's so liberal? Also, because we are multiracial, how do you then work and in da'wah, in politics, in governance, without regard to the presence of non-Malays and non-Muslims in this country? Or, for that matter, how do you talk about a global order without regard for the Chinese or the Arabs or the Indians or the Americans or the Europeans? So how do you then encourage this sort of discourse? I think, Professor Tajuddin, you will realize that it also begins with our understanding. Our students have also the need to understand the other. Because when I was, having some relation with the IIU then, I suggested that we always condemn or criticize the West for not having enough effort to objectively understand and study Islam. See, why can't we also have a course or some disciplines to encourage our students to study the West or the Chinese civilization or the Indian civilization? Then it would be morally acceptable for us to then be more critical. And when we study Chinese civilization and let the Chinese articulate their own views, it's not just from our point of view and the prejudice against them. That I did encourage in our universities to undertake this. Then in our dialogue with the West, we say, look, at least we have this effort done. Dr. Hakim, I'm sorry, tentang regarding religious freedom. Well, there is, compared to many societies, we have religious freedom, but I think it is quite a challenge here. You have seen from time to time incidents against churches or Hindu temples. If they have been constructed according to the laws and the rules established in this country, we must give them the protection and respect. There was an incident in the old government in the state of Selangor where when they demolished a 100-year-old temple, and then I took a stand that that's wrong, that was wrong, and you need to allow them to install. Of course, many complain and say, look, not in India. Hindu fanatics have done so much harm to Muslims, including the Babri Mosque. I said Muslims should not counter by equally giving an unjust treatment. We must show we are morally coherent and consistent, and we cannot be practicing that sort of a double standard. I was in India, in Bombay once, in one of the seminars, and then there was a big hoo-ha. Then that was just soon after the demolishing of the Hindu temple, and I gave this defense of the Hindu temple. And of course, here some of the clerics and the Islamists attacked me ferociously for defending, for defending the Hindus in India, when the Indians, many of the Hindu fanatics were attacking Muslims. But I see if they heard, I was equally firm. I said, I do this in Malaysia because it is my conviction, as I would wish in India, the Muslim minority must be equally protected, and we cannot condone any unjust acts, oppression against the minorities here. But how do I then morally can be considered defensible if I go to India and say it's okay to demolish Hindu temple in Malaysia? Then the Hindus will, and you can imagine the plight of the Muslims then. how can we defend? I don't mind the Hindu temple to be demolished because we are the majority. Islam is the religion of the federation. What happens to the Hindus in India? But precisely because I stood firm that this is a Malaysia, Islam is a religion of the federation, we must recognize that. These have been contract and clearly constitutional guarantee the role of Islam, the Malay rulers, BACA, and also special Malay privileges. But at the same time, the constitutional protection for the right of the non-Muslims must be there and must be honored. And they are citizens of our country, and they must be. I mean, I have lost a lot of some support in the rural heartland among the Muslims because they say that I'm too tolerant of the non-Muslims and too liberal. I don't understand that because to me, I have great confidence in this value of Islam. I feel that as a Muslim, I need to try my level best, as I said, Islah mastata, to show that Muslims are just, not cruel, not oppressive. And I think this is the best effort to portray the teachings of the religion. But of course, it's very, very challenging because a religion, culture, race, language can be very emotive. People will disregard religion, disregard this. Tribalism, I mean, it has been throughout Muslim history, despite the fact that Islam has promoted strongly against tribalism, asabiyah, but still it has always been a major challenge for us to continue to uplift. Again, finally, I must say the relevance of philosophy in this context, the relevance of maqasid, the relevance of viewing a broader framework, what Islam is, what society is, what life is all about. I wanted to initially to mention one great Malay Indonesian scholar, Haji Abdul Malik Karim Amrullah Hamka, who tried to popularize the word falsafah, philosophy, and by writing a series of books, including what we consider falsafah hidup, and make it very easy, simple explanations to popularize the word falsafah and the value of philosophy in our life. And it was really interesting because then it became one of the very, very popular books from the 70s, 80s, and is still being read at present. And I think the society probably may look at it in not a very deep, sort of a compelling academic treatise on philosophy, but to introduce a subject, why philosophy is important in our daily life. Thank you very much again. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullah.